All right, welcome back to Chapter 15. We're going to talk about Section 5, Racial Violence and Reconstruction. Violence really shattered the dream of a biracial democracy. Very still steeped in the violence of slavery, white Southerners could scarcely imagine black free labor. Congressional investigator Carl Schurz reported that in the summer of 1865, Southerners shared a near unanimous sentiment that you cannot make the Negro work without physical compulsion. Violence had been used in the antebellum period to enforce slave labor and really define racial differences. In the post-emancipation period, it was really used to stifle black advancement and return to the old order. Much of the life in the antebellum South had been premised on slavery. The social order really rested on subjugated underclass, and the labor system required unfree laborers. A notion of white supremacy and black inferiority undergirded all of it. Whites were understood as fit for freedom and citizenship, while blacks for chattel slave labor. The Confederacy, they surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and the subsequent adoption of the U.S. Congress of the 13th Amendment really destroyed the institution of American slavery and threw Southern society into disarray. The foundation of the Southern society had been shaken, but Southern whites used black codes and racial terrorism to reassert control of the former slaves. Racial violence during Reconstruction period took three major forms. One, riot against black political authority. Two, interpersonal fighting. And three, organized vigilante groups. There were riots in southern cities several times during Reconstruction. The most notable were the riots in Memphis and New Orleans in 1866, but other large-scale urban conflicts erupted in places like Lawrence, South Carolina in 1870, Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, which is a really interesting event that took place, and you can read all about it right down the road from here. Another in New Orleans in 1874, Yazoo City, Mississippi in 1875, and Hamburg, South Carolina in 1876. Southern cities grew rapidly after the war as migrants from the countryside, particularly freed slaves, flocked to urban centers. Cities became centers of Republican control, but white conservatives chafed at the influx of black residents and the establishment of biracial politics. In nearly every conflict, white conservatives initiated violence in reaction to Republican rallies or conventions or elections in which black men were allowed to vote. The death tolls of these conflicts remain incalculable, and victims were overwhelmingly black. Even everyday violence between individuals disproportionately targeted African Americans during Reconstruction. African Americans gained citizenship rights, like the ability to serve on juries, as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. But Southern white men were almost never prosecuted for violence against black victims. White men beat or shot black men with relative impunity and did so over minor squabbles or labor disputes or long-standing grudges or crimes of passion. These incidents were sometimes reported to local federal authorities like the Army or the Freedmen's Bureau, but more often than not, such violence was unreported and unprosecuted. The violence committed by organized vigilante groups, sometimes called night riders or bushwhackers, was more often premeditated. Groups of night riders operated under the cover of darkness and wore disguises to curtail black political involvement. Night riders harassed and killed black candidates and office holders and frightened voters away from the polls. They also aimed to limit black economic mobility by terrorizing freed people who tried to purchase land or otherwise become too independent from the white masters they used to rely on. They were terrorists and vigilantes, determined to stop the erosion of the antebellum South. They were widespread and numerous, operating all throughout the South. The Ku Klux Klan emerged in the late 1860s as the most infamous of these groups and the biggest losers of them all. The KKK was really organized in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee. It spread to nearly every state in the former Confederacy by 1868. The Klan drew heavily from the antebellum South elite, but Klan groups sometimes overlapped with criminal gangs or former Confederate guerrilla groups. The Klan's reputation became so potent, its violence so widespread, that many groups not formally associated were still called Ku Kluxers, because the word to Ku Klux meant to actually commit vigilante violence. While it is different to differentiate Klan actions from those of similar groups such as the White Line or the Knights of the White Camellia and the White Brotherhood, The distinctions really don't matter. All of these groups are really part of a web of terror that spread throughout the South during Reconstruction. In Panola County, Mississippi, between August 1870 and December of 1872, 24 Klan-style murders occurred. In nearby Lafayette County, Klansmen drowned 30 black Mississippians in a single mass murder, took them to the river, drowned them. Sometimes the violence was aimed at black men or women who tried to buy land or dared to be insolent toward a white Southerner. Other times, as with the beating of a Republican sheriff and tax collector Allen Huggins, the Klan targeted white politicians who supported freed people's civil rights. Numerous Republican politicians, perhaps dozens, were killed, either while in office or campaigning. Thousands of individual citizens, men and women, white and black, had their homes raided and were whipped, raped, and murdered. The federal government responded to the South paramilitary tactics by passing the Enforcement Acts between 1870 and 1871. These acts made it a crime to deprive African Americans of their civil rights. The act also deemed violent Klan behavior as acts of rebellion against the United States and allowed for the rise of the use of U.S. troops to protect the freed people. For a time, the federal government, its courts, and its troops sought to put an end to the KKK and other related groups, but the violence continued anyway. By 1876, the Southern Democrats reestablished home rule and redeemed the South from Republicans. Federal opposition to the KKK eventually weakened. National attention shifted away from the South and the activities of the Klan, but African Americans remained trapped in a world of white supremacy that restricted their economic, social, and political rights. Now, white conservatives would also assert that Republicans, in denouncing violence, were waving a bloody shirt for political opportunity. The violence, according to many white conservatives, was fabricated or not as bad as they claimed, or, an unavoidable consequence of the enfranchisement of African Americans, which is insane. On December 22nd, 1871, R. Latham of Yorkville, South Carolina, wrote to the New York Tribune, voicing the beliefs of many white Southerners, as he declared that the same principle that prompted the white men at Boston, disguised as Indians, to board during the dark of night a vessel with tea and to throw her cargo into the bay, clothed some of our people in Ku Klux gowns and sent them out on missions technically illegal. Did the Ku Klux do wrong? You are ready to say that they did, and we will not argue the point with you. Under the peculiar circumstance, what could the people of South Carolina but resort to Ku Kluxing? That dude, I hope he had a terrible death. Victims and witnesses to the violence told a different story, though. Sadie Atkins of Warren County, Georgia, was traveling with her husband, Joseph, who was a Georgia state senator. He was assassinated by Klansmen on May 10th of 1869. She wrote to President Grant asking for both physical protection and justice. She said, "I'm no statesman. I'm only a poor woman whose husband has been murdered for his devotion to the country. I mean, I may have very foolish ideas of government, states, and constitutions, but I feel that I have claims upon my country. The rebels imprisoned my husband. Pardoned rebels murdered him. There's no law for the punishment of them who do the deeds of this sort. I demand that you, President Grant, keep the pledge you made to the nation. Make it safe for any man to utter boldly and openly his devotion to the United States." Seems pretty straightforward. The political and social consequences of violence were lasting, as the physical and mental trauma suffered by victims and witnesses was as well. Terrorism worked to end federal involvement in Reconstruction, helped usher in a new era of racial repression. African Americans actively sought ways to shed the vestiges of slavery. Many discarded the names of their former masters that had been chosen for them and adopted new names like Freeman or Lincoln that affirmed their new identities as free citizens. Others resettled far from their former plantations, hoping to eventually farm their own land or run their own businesses. By the end of Reconstruction, the desire for self-definition, economic independence, and racial pride coalesced into the founding of dozens of black towns across the South. Perhaps the most well-known of these was Mound Bayou, Mississippi, a delta town established in 1887 by Isaiah Montgomery and Ben Green, who were former slaves of Joseph and Jefferson Davis. Residents of the town took pride in the fact that African Americans owned all the property in town, including the banks, insurance companies, shops, and surrounding farms. The town celebrated African American cultural and economic achievements during their annual festival, Mound Bayou Days. These tight-knit communities provided African Americans with spaces where they could live free from the indignities of segregation and the exploitation of sharecropping on white-owned plantations. Section 6 deals with the economic development during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Now, the Civil War really destroyed the American economy and then transformed it. During 1859 to 1860, wealthy Southern planters were flush after producing record cotton crops. Southern prosperity relied on over 4 million African American slaves to grow the cotton, along with a number of other staple crops across the region. Cotton fed the textile mills of America and Europe and brought great wealth to that region. However, on the eve of war, the American South was enjoying more per capita wealth than any other slave economy in the New World. To their masters, slaves constituted their most valuable assets, worth roughly $3 billion. Yet this wealth obscured the gains in infrastructure, industrial production, and financial markets that occurred north of the Mason-Dixon line, a fact that the war would unmask for all to see. In contrast to the slave South, Northerners praised their region as a land of free labor, populated by farmers and merchants and wage laborers, but it was also home to a robust market economy. By 1860, Northerners could buy clothes made in New England factory or light their homes with kerosene from Pennsylvania. The Midwest produced seas of grain that fed the country, with enough left over to export to Europe. Farther west, mining and agriculture were the mainstays of life, along with the textile mills, shoe factories, iron foundries, including the firms that produced McCormick's wheat harvesters and Colt's firearms, which displayed the technical advances of northern manufacturers. Their goods crisscrossed the country on the North's growing railroad network. An extensive network of banks and financial markets helped aggregate capital that could then be reinvested into the future growth. The Civil War, like all wars, interrupted the rhythm of commercial life by destroying lives and property. This was especially true in the South from 1861 onward. The Confederate government struggled to find the guns, food, and supplies needed to field an army. Southerners did make astonishing gains in industrial production during this time, but it was really never enough. The Union's blockade of the Atlantic prevented the Confederacy from financing the war with cotton sales to Europe. To pay their troops and keep the economy alive, the Confederate Congress ended up turning to printing money, which quickly sank in value and led to rapid inflation. In many cases, Confederate officials dispensed with taxes paid in cash and simply impressed the food and materials needed from their citizens. Perhaps the most striking of it all, in the vast agricultural wealth of the South, many Southerners struggled to find enough to eat. The war also pushed the U.S. government to take unprecedented steps. Congress raised tariffs, passed the first national income tax in 1862. In late 1861, Congress created the nation's first fiat currency called greenbacks. At first, the expansion of currency and the rapid rise in government spending created an uptick in business in 1862 and 63. As the war dragged on, though, inflation would also hit the North. Workers demanded higher wages to pay rents and buy necessities. While the business community groaned under the growing burden of taxes, the United States never embarked a policy of impressment for foods and supplies. The factories and farms of the North successfully supplied Union troops, while federal government, with some adjustments, found the means to pay for the war. None of this is to suggest, though, that the North's superior ability to supply its war machine made the outcome of the war inevitable. Any account of the war must consider the tangled webs of politics, battles, and economics that occurred between 1861 and 1865. But the aftermath of the war left portions of the Confederacy in ruins, state governments mired in debt, white planters had most of their capital tied up in slaves, and so lost most of their wealth. Cotton remained the most significant crop, but the war changed how it was grown and sold. Planters broke up large farms into smaller plots, tended by single families in exchange for a portion of the crop, a system called sharecropping. Once cotton production resumed, Americans found that their cotton now competed with new cotton plantations around the world. For the South as a whole, the war and Reconstruction marked the start of a period of deep poverty that would last until the New Deal of the 1930s. Emancipation was the single most economic, social, and political outcome of the war. Freedom empowered African Americans in the South to rebuild families, make contracts, hold property, and move freely for the first time. Republicans in the South attempted to transform that region into a free labor economy like the North, yet the transition from slave labor to free labor was never so clear. Well into the 20th century, white Southerners used a combination of legal coercion and extra-legal violence to maintain systems of bound labor. Vagrancy laws enabled law enforcement to justify the arrest of innocent black men and women. and the convict lease system meant that arbitrary arrests often resulted in decades of forced, uncompensated labor. But this new form of servitude, which continued until World War II, was only the most extreme example of an array of economic injustices. In the later 19th century, poor whites would form mobs and go white-capping to scare away black job seekers. Lacking the means to buy their own farms, black farmers often turned to sharecropping, which led to other cycles of debt that kept families bound to the land. Victory did not produce a sudden economic boom for the rest of the United States either. The North would not regain its pre-war pace of industrial and commodity output until the 1870s. But the war did prove beneficial to wealthy northern farmers who could afford new technologies. Wartime labor shortages promoted the use of mechanical reapers, reducing demand for labor and boosting farm yields, and sowing seeds of inequality as well. Wartime laws also transformed the relationship between federal government and the American economy. New tariff laws sheltered northern industry from European competition. The Morrill Land Grant helped create colleges such as the University of California, the University of Illinois, the University of Wisconsin. With the creation of the national banking system and greenbacks, Congress replaced hundreds of state banknotes with a system of federal currency that accelerated trade and exchange. This is not to say that Republican policy worked for everyone. The Homestead Act meant to open the West to small farmers was often frustrated by railroad corporations and speculators. The Transcontinental Railroad, launched during the war, failed to produce substantial economic gains for years. The war years forged a close relationship between government and business elite, a relationship that sometimes resulted in corruption and catastrophe, as it did when the markets crashed on Black Friday, September 24, 1869. This new relationship created political backlash, especially in the West and the South, against Washington's perceived Eastern and industrial bias. Conflicts over emancipation and civil rights quickly gave way to long political conflict over the direction of American economic development.